It's 1945, and World War II is over. The United States is euphoric over its victory in the war. The US has established itself as the world's superpower. With the peace won, over 10 million Americans came home to rebuild their lives. Post-war America was a different place than when the GIs left it. After World War II, the United States economy needed to reconvert its goods from wartime goods to peacetime goods. We no longer needed tanks, we now needed cars. But with that conversion came economic problems. After World War II, the United States faced an economic recession. The economy began to slow down. With defense contracts canceled, we no longer were paying firms to build war goods. Because of this, unemployment rose. World War II veterans who came home couldn't find jobs. And when price controls that were set during wartime were removed, prices rose across the economy, making things more expensive, while at the same time, wages sank, meaning people had less money to spend. Threatened by a post-war depression, President Harry Truman had to respond. Truman ordered that wartime price controls be reset in order to keep the price of goods down. And he also set a wage floor, or a minimum wage that people would be paid for a job. This ensured people had enough income to pay for goods to meet their needs. But as conditions worsened and economic problems got worse, the nation faced massive labor strikes from unions who had agreed not to strike during the war, but now felt the time had come to ask for better benefits and better pay. These strikes threatened to cripple the economy. Truman couldn't allow this to happen, and in response, he ended the strikes by threatening to draft any striking workers into the US military. It was time to go back to work or to hit the front lines.
As the nation returned to normal, consumers began to revive the economy. Americans saved over $135 billion during World War II in savings and in war bonds, and they were ready to splurge. Americans bought homes, cars, appliances, and other goods rationed during World War II. There was high demand for these products, which meant businesses had to create jobs. Unemployment sank, income increased, and the standard of living rose. Your standard of living is the quality of life that you live. To fight the Cold War, the United States government increased defense spending and foreign aid. Hundreds of billions were spent in the private sector, which helped stimulate the economy. In the late 1940s, Americans wanted to settle down and build their lives. The government issued the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, also known as the GI Bill of Rights. This helped World War II veterans ease back into civilian life. It provided low-interest loans, unemployment benefits, tuition aid, and the ability to buy homes. The GI Bill helped soldiers return home back into the job they had before they left. They were guaranteed this job for 1 year. If they were a student, they were guaranteed to get re-enrolled into the university that they left in order to fight in the war. Mass production techniques were used to spur suburban housing, to build tract homes in the suburbs outside of the cities. Houses were identical, they all had yards, and they were on planned streets. It had a small town feel and were typically under $7,000. Americans had the ability to settle down, have a family, a home, a yard, and a normal life.
With American life returning to normal, the latter half of the 1940s is dominated by post-war politics. At the center of politics was President Harry S. Truman. Truman's legacy as president was dropping the atomic bomb to end World War II, the Truman Doctrine in foreign policy, and his philosophy, the buck stops here. A humble Missouri farmer, Truman was not a politician by nature, and he was honest. He can make tough decisions, and he liked to take responsibility for the consequences. Truman had a sign on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." What this means is, ultimately, regardless if a decision was good or bad, he would take responsibility for it because he was the president of the United States. This made Truman well liked, but ultimately he was blamed for the bad post-war economy. In 1946, the Republican Party took control of Congress and began to ignore Truman's wishes as president. This Congress was nicknamed the Do-Nothing Congress because they refused to work with President Truman. They also passed laws that began to repeal New Deal policies. For example, they passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which repealed labor union rights. Unpopular with the voters and frustrated by a Do-Nothing Congress, Truman staked his re-election in 1948 on the issue of civil rights. Truman saw civil rights as a good and moral cause, and believed it wrong that black veterans who served in World War II were denied their rights when they returned home. In Truman's eyes, if he would lose the presidency in 1948, at least he would go down doing something he thought was right. With Congress refusing to act, Truman signed a series of executive orders on civil rights. First, Truman integrated the United States military for the very first time, so that blacks and whites could serve alongside each other. Truman also made it illegal to discriminate based on race when hiring government employees. Both were a first in United States history. In protest to Truman's unprecedented stance on civil rights, white Southern Democrats decided to leave the Democratic Party, and they formed their own party, known as the Dixiecrats. The Dixiecrats were white Southern Democrats who opposed Truman's support of integration. The South had been Democratic since the end of the Civil War, but that was about to change.
The election of 1948 was a standoff between the Democratic candidate Harry Truman, the Republican Thomas Dewey, and the Dixiecrat Strom Thurmond. With the Democrats divided, Truman's chances for re-election were grim in 1948. A majority of the country backed conservatism and the GOP's Thomas Dewey. The Republicans successfully blamed the economy on Truman and tapped into anti-civil rights voters. The night before the election, Dewey held a comfortable lead, and Truman thought he'd lose. Against all odds, Truman pulls off the greatest upset in American political history and wins the election of 1948. Even the Chicago Tribune prematurely printed a headline stating Dewey defeats Truman. Once re-elected, Truman pursued an aggressive domestic plan. This was called the Fair Deal. He saw it as an extension of FDR's New Deal and the principles that FDR had listed in his second Bill of Rights before he died.
A second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all. The right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care, and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment, the right to a good education.
Truman was successful in raising the minimum wage to boost the United States income. He extended Social Security coverage for 10 million Americans, and he initiated programs to clean up city slums. However, Congress defeated his primary program of universal health care. Universal health care would be a government-run health care program to help aid Americans who could not afford their own health care. This would become one of the most important issues for every Democratic candidate since Harry Truman, even to today.
After the Fair Deal, Harry Truman's presidency would be dominated by foreign policy and the Cold War abroad. In 1952, when he leaves the presidency, the Republicans take over with a general who is immensely popular during World War II, setting a new agenda for American politics.